Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories. Here we tell slow and gentle tales from history. Stories that calm your mind and help you fall asleep. If you enjoy the journey, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin tonight's dreamy story. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might sound a bit dry at first glance, but I promise, by the end, your eyelids will be pleasantly heavy, and your brain will feel like it's floating through time. So, go ahead, dim the lights, get comfy, maybe even grab a blanket. Let's drift gently into the world of medieval calendars and the curious, oddly rigid rhythms of feast days. Now, the medieval calendar. On paper, it seems simple enough. A year divided into months, weeks, and days, with each day marching along like a dutiful monk reciting prayers. But, of course, nothing in medieval Europe was ever simple. The calendar was constantly evolving, slowly being patched together over centuries. More like a quilt made from mismatched scraps than the tidy Gregorian calendar you might glance at on your phone today. And yes, people did actually care. At least, they cared enough to argue endlessly about it while sipping lukewarm ale. You see, the early medieval period inherited a bit of a mess from the Romans. The Julian calendar, instituted by Julius Caesar, because of course he had to leave a mark on time itself, was a decent starting point, but it had its flaws. Mainly, it didn't quite match the solar year. The solar year, that is, the actual trip Earth takes around the Sun, is about 365.24 to 2 days. The Julian calendar thought it was 365.25 days, which, if you like precision, is kind of a big deal. Over centuries, this little mismatch added up. By the 10th century, if you were trying to celebrate Christmas on December 25th, you were actually a few days off from the astronomical event it was supposed to honor. But hey, who needed precision when you could just light candles and eat roast goose, right? Feast days were, naturally, the medieval way of keeping life interesting. Each saint had at least one day assigned to their memory, and sometimes entire weeks were dedicated to a cluster of minor saints whose biographies had been mostly lost to time. The liturgical year was this elaborate, self-perpetuating cycle of celebrations, commemorations, and fasts. Advent, Lent, Pentecost, each season came with its own set of do's and don'ts. And yes, peasants and nobles alike were supposed to follow this calendar closely, although enforcement was, predictably, spotty by the 12th century. Monasteries had become the unofficial keepers of time. Monks would copy calendars into illuminated manuscripts, filling margins with tiny doodles, sometimes animals, sometimes the occasional marginally rude joke that made sense only to monks who were tired of chanting the same psalms over and over. These manuscripts weren't just for record keeping. They were an art form, painstakingly crafted, and also a kind of passive-aggressive reminder that everyone else was behind on their feast days. One of the strangest things about the medieval calendar is how it treated leap years. Remember the Julian leap year rule? Add a day every 4 years, no exceptions. Simple, yes, but not quite accurate. By the 16th century, this had caused enough drift that Pope Gregory XIII decided to step in and adjust things. The Gregorian reform, which we still use today, skipped several days to bring the calendar back in line with the seasons. Imagine waking up one morning and finding out that your October had just disappeared. People weren't thrilled, as you can imagine. Where did my birthday go? Some poor noble might have muttered, clutching a half-eaten bread roll. Feast days themselves had an oddly democratic chaos. The big ones, Christmas, Easter, Michaelmas, everyone knew about. Then there were the minor feasts that only mattered if you lived in a specific region or belonged to a particular guild or monastery. St. Swithin's Day, for example, was a rather gloomy feast if you were concerned about rain, because folklore claimed it predicted the next 40 days of weather. A kind of medieval meteorology if you squinted. Of course, everyone argued about the date because, again, calendars drifted, and local customs often overrode official PayPal directives. Now, let's float over to another curiosity: movable feasts. Easter, the centerpiece of the Christian calendar, never fell on the same day twice in a row, which must have been both thrilling and mildly inconvenient. Calculating it required a rather complicated set of rules involving the moon, the spring equinox, and various ecclesiastical assumptions that only clerics fully understood. It was enough to make a layperson give up and just trust that the priest would announce the date loudly enough at Sunday Mass, and because Easter floated, all other dependent feasts, Pentecost, Ascension, Ash Wednesday, floated with it. So, the calendar wasn't just a static backdrop. It was a slow-moving river of feasts that shifted depending on celestial alignments and church politics. And speaking of politics, the imposition of feast days wasn't just spiritual. Monarchs used them as tools to control labor. A king might declare an extra feast day to keep workers from tiling his new hall or planting crops. Sometimes it backfired spectacularly, leaving the royal granaries a bit emptier than planned because everyone was too busy eating and praying to sow the wheat. The calendar was a subtle lever of authority, a gentle but effective reminder that time itself was under the sway of both God and sovereigns, of course. Not every feast was cheerful. Many commemorated tragedies, the deaths of saints, local plagues, or, occasionally, massacres that were retroactively sanctified. And yet, these solemn days were interspersed with surprisingly mundane ones, like days dedicated to the cleaning of churches or the blessing of animals. The medieval imagination, in its slow, contemplative rhythm, didn't necessarily distinguish between what we'd call important or trivial. Every day could be sacred or mildly ceremonial, depending on who was looking. And then there's the curious case of saints whose feast days seemed designed to make people vaguely uncomfortable or puzzled. Take Saint Apollonia, for example. She had a feast day, yes, celebrated on February 9th, and she's now mainly remembered as the patron saint of dentistry. Yes, dentistry, in a period when teeth were largely ignored until they screamed in pain. People probably didn't know what to do, light a candle for her, or avoid opening their mouths too widely. Medieval life had this delicate balance between devotion and quiet dread. You could spend a whole morning singing hymns, then wince all afternoon at a toothache, wondering if you'd done the saintly thing correctly. Local variations also made calendars wonderfully unpredictable. If you lived in France, you might celebrate Saint Denis with a lavish procession. In England, he was somewhat obscure, and your calendar might instead emphasize Saint George, who, of course, was always killing dragons in imagination, if not in historical reality. Italy had saints like Catherine of Siena, whose feast day involved elaborate rituals of fasting and prayer, but also, curiously, the blessing of newly spun wool. Medieval logic was flexible, sometimes bordering on the arbitrary, which, for sleepy contemplation, is exactly the kind of thing that helps you drift off. Feast days could also conflict. Imagine being a devout peasant, carefully noting every single saintly day in your little calendar. One week, your village is celebrating Saint Lambert, who, apparently, liked to be remembered with roasted piglets and hymn singing. The very next day, the town council insists on honoring Saint Valentine, because why not double down on love and devotion in the middle of winter? You might end up missing a fast here, lighting the wrong candles there, and feeling just a touch guilty, but also incredibly full. Medieval calendars were not just records of time, they were mildly stressful guides to ethical dining and social behavior. Speaking of food, feast days were an excuse to eat, and eat lavishly. Meat, pastries, wine, things that were rare on ordinary days, appeared in abundance. In some regions, certain feasts even prescribed specific dishes. The Feast of the Ass, yes, it was a real feast, involved reenacting parts of the Nativity with, well, a donkey present, and sometimes included eating delicacies associated with the event. These culinary traditions became deeply entwined with local identity. If you missed the goose at Michaelmas, your neighbors might quietly judge your devotion or your digestion. And yes, judgment mattered more than you'd think in a world where social and spiritual capital were as important as grain reserves. Monasteries continued to be the central hubs for marking time. In Benedictine monasteries, the calendar was not just a reference, it was a ritualized heartbeat. Bells would ring at canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, Each hour was punctuated by the lighting of candles and the chanting of psalms. Monks often remarked on the monotony, but secretly enjoyed the rhythmic predictability. And here's a fun detail for insomnia aficionados. Sometimes monks would calculate feast days according to obscure astronomical phenomena, like the rising of a specific star or the lunar phase, because medieval clerics were a meticulous, slightly obsessive bunch. These calculations often had tiny errors, producing regional quirks in calendars. One village might celebrate Easter a week earlier than its neighbor, and the entire local market schedule would shift accordingly. Calendars weren't just about holidays and rituals. They were also about control. Nobles used them to manage serfs and tenants. For example, certain feasts were legal holidays, meaning no labor. Planting or harvesting could be delayed, because no self-respecting peasant would work on St. Bartholomew's Day. Conversely, skipping a feast could invite mild but pointed criticism from local authorities, who would observe whether you were keeping up appearances. The calendar subtly enforced hierarchy, reminding everyone who decided when to eat, pray, and toil that. Now, let's talk about the progression of months themselves. The medieval year had 12 months, sure, but each had a personality. January was cold and grey, a time for reflection and minor saints. February was wet, and often associated with penitential observances, though it also contained the occasional oddball feast, like the aforementioned Saint Apollonia. March began the slow thaw, but also the season of movable feasts, which meant monks were particularly busy calculating Easter dates. April brought feasts of flowers and fledglings, although most people were too busy planting crops to celebrate properly. May, June, and July had a mix of saints, harvest preparation, and obligatory fasts, depending on the region. By August and September, the calendar shifted toward preparation for Michaelmas, a major feast which reminded everyone, royal and peasant alike, that the harvest was the calendar's secret priority. October, November, and December brought a blend of solemnity, minor saints, and, of course, Christmas, which was the most universally recognized feast of all. Regardless of calendar discrepancies, The idea of seasons being tied to feast days was not accidental. Medieval Europeans relied heavily on the church calendar to regulate agricultural, commercial, and social life. If you missed a planting day because a feast fell inconveniently, you might curse the saint quietly while still observing their day, because open criticism was frowned upon. And sometimes, the saintly calendar conflicted with practical reality. For example, Lent sometimes coincided with early spring planting, which required labor and made fasting slightly more challenging. But hey, nothing says devotion like a tired, half-hungry peasant trudging through muddy fields while silently contemplating the life of a distant martyr. And then there's the issue of intercalation. To keep calendars roughly aligned with the seasons, extra days or months would occasionally be inserted. The Romans had done this with a little month called Mercedonius, which sounds like a luxury brand, but was mostly just a buffer to prevent crops from planting too early or too late. The medieval church inherited and adapted these systems, though sometimes local bishops would interpret instructions creatively, either out of necessity or mild mischief. You could end up with a local festival that technically didn't exist according to the universal calendar, but everyone celebrated it anyway. Flexibility was a survival skill, both agricultural and spiritual. Alright, now that we've drifted lazily through the general structure of the medieval calendar, let's look at the people who made it feel, well, alive, or at least mildly interesting in the gentle, tragic way that history often is. After all, a calendar is only as entertaining as the humans who struggle to follow it, or ignore it entirely. Monks were the first real specialists in the art of sleep-inducing timekeeping. Imagine a monastery, somewhere in northern France or England, around the 11th century. You have a dozen or more monks, each meticulously noting feast days, lunar cycles, and movable feasts, while simultaneously murmuring prayers at regular intervals. Now, these weren't particularly cheerful people, and that monotony shows. Some of them developed what we might call creative quirks in their manuscripts, tiny marginal sketches of half-naked humans or animals behaving badly. It wasn't rebellion, exactly, but a subtle way of saying, yes, I am recording time, but my mind wanders, as yours surely does too. One monk, whose name has mercifully faded from history, became infamous for miscalculating Easter. Every few years, the local bishop would have to correct him, because suddenly Easter fell either a week too early or a week too late. And yes, the villagers noticed, because their planting, weddings, and minor feasts were all contingent on that date. The monk probably muttered something like, "The stars made me do it," while secretly enjoying the minor chaos. This tiny error is the kind of human imperfection that keeps history slightly relatable, and, importantly, extremely soporific when read aloud in a slow monotone. Kings, naturally, had their own relationships with feast days, and they were usually complicated. Take Louis IX of France, known later as Saint Louis. He was deeply devout, which meant he adhered strictly to the liturgical calendar. Every feast, fast, and fast-breaking event was carefully noted in his household. Louis reportedly once spent several hours lamenting whether he had properly observed a minor saint's day in his youth, a level of concern that would terrify any modern bureaucrat. And yes, he was the king, which meant his minor errors became royal policy by proxy. Imagine the royal kitchen suddenly adjusting menus because the king had remembered a feast incorrectly. The mental image alone is enough to slow your breathing into a gentle rhythm. Meanwhile, in England, King Henry III had a different problem. he was chronically indecisive about feast days, often postponing celebrations for no particular reason. A royal scribe wrote in his chronicle that the king doth tarry long before honouring St. Edward, as if time itself were too hasty for him. Nobles, clergy, and peasants all quietly rescheduled their obligations around his whims, producing what could politely be described as a mild national calendar confusion. Over the course of decades, these small irregularities compounded, creating tiny pockets of historical drift that modern historians can trace, mainly to note how inefficient medieval bureaucracy could be now. Let's drift to a slightly darker, but still calm observation: the human consequences of feast days. Royal children, for instance, were often subjected to strict schedules dictated by liturgical observances. A young prince or princess might be expected to fast on certain days, even during winter, or attend multiple services in a single day. Some children were reportedly so malnourished during fasting periods that they became frail, pale, and prone to fainting, perfectly suited to the serene, sleep-inducing narrative we are weaving tonight. And yes, inbreeding among royal families sometimes compounded these frailties, producing heirs who were simultaneously fragile and adored. Because aesthetics always outweighed practicality in dynastic Europe. Speaking of inbreeding, let's drift over to the Habsburgs for a moment. Charles II of Spain, a famously fragile figure, was expected to participate in certain feasts and religious observances from a very young age. Despite his physical limitations, courtiers insisted on ceremonial participation. Imagine him barely able to lift a goblet, dutifully attending processions, surrounded by people who were almost certainly whispering about his appearance. Calendars dictated his movements, and in a sense, the liturgical schedule became a framework for the slow, delicate tragedy of his early life. Monks continued to refine their systems. In some monasteries, they kept elaborate computers tables, essentially primitive spreadsheets for calculating the date of Easter decades in advance. These tables often filled entire pages of manuscripts, covered in cryptic symbols and shorthand. Some of them even included notes about what local nobles were expected to provide for the monks during feast days: wine, bread, or chickens. Yes, ecclesiastical accounting and timekeeping were intertwined. By the time you read aloud about these tables in a calm, measured tone, you may feel a gentle drowsiness, as if the combination of arithmetic, devotion, and minor political intrigue lulls your brain into slow, rhythmic waves. And then, of course, there were feast day competitions between monasteries. One abbey might declare a slightly more lavish feast for St. Benedict's Day, prompting a neighboring abbey to outdo them the following year. This minor rivalry often involved extravagant cakes, extra candles, and occasionally the inclusion of obscure saints no one had ever heard of, just to seem more pious or wealthy. It's all very polite, very bureaucratic, and very boring. Perfect for drifting off. Even commoners engaged in these rituals, though in a much simpler way. A village might hold a procession for a local patron saint, involving singing, the occasional dance, and a shared meal. Some of these celebrations became annual highlights, while others drifted into obscurity. In a few rare cases, a local saint's feast day could be so minor that only a single villager observed it, usually out of devotion or stubbornness. Imagine quietly honoring Saint something or other, while your neighbors ignore you entirely. And you can see why this would not make exciting news. But it makes for perfectly slow storytelling. Calendars and feast days also influenced trade and labor. Bakers, brewers, and butchers all relied on predictable feast days to sell specialty products. A feast day meant higher demand for meat, bread, and wine. A miscalculated date could result in spoilage, minor financial loss, and quiet disappointment. Merchants often had their own calendars within the calendar, marking which saints' days required extra stock and which were better left ordinary. It was a delicate balance between devotion, commerce, and practicality, all unfolding at a sleepy pace across Europe. One of the most delightfully tedious aspects of medieval life was, of course, the movable feasts. Easter, as I mentioned before, had a kind of flexible personality, refusing to settle on a single date. This meant that clergy, peasants, and royalty alike had to adjust their calendars year after year. Clerics would spend hours calculating the correct date, using lunar cycles and equinox while peasants were left squinting at the skies and trusting that someone somewhere knew what they were doing. Sometimes this led to fascinatingly minor crises. A wedding scheduled to coincide with Easter had to be postponed, a harvest festival delayed, or a market moved because, as everyone knew, nothing was more pressing than aligning human activity with celestial whims. In some regions, disagreements over the exact timing of Easter caused genuine calendar confusion. England and parts of France might celebrate on slightly different days, depending on which local bishop or monastery was consulted. Imagine trying to plan your life in a world where your neighbor's feast day could be a week off from yours. You could attend church, pray diligently, fast appropriately, and still end up technically out of sync with the larger religious community. The mind reels at the slow, bureaucratic stress of it all, but also, perhaps, this is exactly the kind of tedious complexity that lulls you into a gentle, contemplative sleep. Feast days, of course, weren't just abstract concepts. They were often tied to real, living personalities. Local saints, minor royals, or even tragic figures from the past could have days dedicated to them. Some were relatively obscure, celebrated only in a handful of villages. Others were universally recognized, like Saint Nicholas, whose feast on December 6th became a cornerstone of winter observances. The curious thing is that many of these saints had biographical details that were either lost or, in some cases, entirely fabricated. Hagiography, the writing of saintly lives, was less concerned with accuracy and more with providing a template for moral reflection. A saint might perform miraculous deeds, suffer noble martyrdom, or just quietly die while annoying local authorities. And all of it would be recorded as worthy of annual remembrance. Monks and scribes sometimes had a peculiar sense of humor when it came to these records. Marginalia in illuminated calendars could contain tiny sketches of saints behaving in mildly absurd ways. Perhaps St. Lawrence, famed for his martyrdom on a gridiron, is shown roasting vegetables or chatting with a slightly bewildered angel. These images were not just decoration, they were subtle reminders that even the most serious, structured aspects of medieval life were subject to human imagination and whimsy. And yes, describing these images slowly is perfect for maintaining a calm, drifting rhythm in narration. Meanwhile, monarchs used feast days strategically. Henry II of England, for example, occasionally aligned certain royal edicts with feast days to ensure compliance. If you wanted peasants to show up for a tax collection, scheduling it just after a minor feast worked wonders. They were already in the village, possibly carrying a leftover pastry, still vaguely contemplative from church prayers. Conversely, Declaring a feast day could also be a form of subtle coercion. Labor would halt, nobles would parade, and the king could assert his presence without explicit force. Calendars, in this sense, became instruments of governance. They were not just about measuring time, but about structuring society itself in ways both practical and ceremonial. Sometimes, these arrangements had unintended consequences. For example, a particularly elaborate feast in the court of Louis IV of France required the coordination of multiple monasteries and towns. One monastery miscalculated the date by a few days. Consequently, a shipment of wine arrived too early and began to ferment inappropriately, producing a slightly disagreeable vintage. Courtiers complained softly, while the king nodded gravely, pretending he understood the problem. And while modern readers might yawn at the minor inconvenience, it's precisely the kind of slow, human-centered anecdote that keeps the story comfortably sober. In addition to courts and monasteries, urban centers also engaged with feast days in interesting ways. Markets were often synchronized with religious observances. A saint's feast day could mean extra business for bakers, butchers, and cloth merchants, because people had leisure time and the money to spend. Miss the feast, and you might miss your chance to purchase a rare commodity, like a fine wool cloak or a rare herring. Small annoyances like this were woven into daily life, gradually creating a network of social rhythms that revolved around saints, celestial events, and human patience. And then there were feast days that were just, frankly, absurd. Some commemorated events so minor that only the smallest, most meticulous scribes bothered to note them. For instance, a saint who apparently disliked cats might have a feast day involving careful observation of feline behavior. Others were linked to almost arbitrary natural events, like the blooming of a specific flower or the migration of certain birds. For villagers and clerics, this created a slowly shifting pattern of duties, observances, and occasional confusion. The calendar was not static. It moved, expanded, contracted, and occasionally contradicted itself. Let's also not forget the role of astronomy. Calculating the date of Easter required careful observation of the moon's phases. Some monasteries maintained rudimentary observatories, towers with openings for sighting the moon and stars, often accompanied by marginal sketches of curious, sleeping monks leaning against their desks. Errors were common, and over the course of decades, discrepancies accumulated. Imagine a monastery confidently announcing the feast day of a saint, only to discover that the moon was slightly off schedule. Minor panic would ensue, prayers would be recited more fervently, and the villagers would probably shrug and carry on with their bread making. Feast days also influenced personal rituals. Royal children were expected to observe fasts and attend services with meticulous adherence to the calendar. Their tutors, often stern monks or minor nobles, would ensure that every day's religious obligations were met. One minor prince might have to memorize the lives of dozens of saints, attend multiple services, and still manage to avoid eating meat or sweets on prohibited days. This created a rhythm of life that was simultaneously structured, tedious, and slightly absurd. From our modern perspective, it reads like a slow, tedious ballet of devotion and minor discomfort, perfectly suited for our sleepy monologue tonight. All right, let's settle in and drift lazily into the slightly more bureaucratic, slightly more eccentric side of medieval timekeeping. By now, you're comfortable with the rhythm of calendars and feast days. So we can look at the humans who tried to bend these systems to their will, sometimes successfully, sometimes with spectacularly minor failures. One of the most famous interventions came from Pope Gregory XIII, who, in 1582, decided that the Julian calendar was just not cutting it anymore. The Julian calendar had been drifting against the solar year for centuries, and Easter was starting to feel a bit off. So, Gregory decreed a correction, skipping 10 days to bring the calendar back in line with the equinox. That meant that, in parts of Europe, people went to bed on October 4th and woke up on October 15th. 10 days gone, just like that. Imagine checking your diary and realizing your birthday might have been cancelled. Some townspeople were understandably miffed, murmuring to themselves about lost rent, lost markets, or lost personal time. But the Pope wasn't. He was, after all, saving the universe from chronological chaos, or at least keeping Easter properly aligned with the moon. Not everyone accepted the Gregorian reform immediately. Protestant regions, particularly in Northern Europe, resisted for decades. Calendars diverged dramatically. You could attend church in one town and celebrate Easter on a completely different day than your neighbor 20 miles away. This created a quietly frustrating patchwork of dates, which, if you think about it, must have been perfect for a historian narrating it slowly in a soothing monotone. There's a certain rhythm to human confusion when it persists for decades without anyone dying violently over it. Monarchs, naturally, had their own responses. Some adopted the new calendar with bureaucratic precision, while others dithered. Queen Elizabeth I of England, for instance, initially ignored the papal decree, which meant that English feast days gradually drifted away from continental Europe's, creating minor diplomatic headaches and the occasional royal misstep. Clerks and scribes had to maintain dual calendars, noting both the old style and the new style dates. One can only imagine their slightly weary sighs, chalk dust in the air, quill in hand, carefully aligning days that stubbornly refused to cooperate, of course. Not all calendar problems were about astronomical accuracy. Many were about sheer human eccentricity. Some kings and nobles liked to declare additional feast days for obscure reasons. Maybe a saint had a surprisingly amusing anecdote associated with them. Maybe the king simply wanted an excuse for a lavish banquet. These self-created feasts added layers of complexity to an already crowded calendar. Monks quietly recorded them. Villagers complied with varying degrees of enthusiasm. And historians, centuries later, shake their heads and say, "Of course this happened." Take, for example, King Charles IV of Bohemia. He had a habit of declaring local saints' feast days to commemorate victories, acquisitions, or simply to impress visiting nobles. One minor saint, whose life was so obscure that we barely know it today, became celebrated with a feast that included processions, musical performances, and unusually large servings of roasted fowl. Imagine attending such an event while also trying to keep track of Lent, a lunar calculated Easter, and the usual cycle of saints' days. It's all very slow, very bureaucratic, and very soporific. Perfect for tonight's storytelling rhythm. Calendars also affected peasants in subtle but persistent ways. Missing a feast day wasn't necessarily disastrous, but it could result in minor social friction. If the village expected everyone to attend a saint's procession and you didn't, you might be gently shamed or teased. Conversely, overzealous participation could be frowned upon as ostentation. Villagers lived in a constant, low-level negotiation with time, faith, and social expectation, and this rhythm, repeated year after year, became the slow heartbeat of medieval rural life, one particularly gentle, anecdote involves the feast of Saint Swithin in England. According to folklore, if it rained on July 15th, it would rain for 40 days thereafter. Clerics dutifully recorded the weather, sometimes noting it in the margins of manuscripts, and peasants observed the superstition with mild bemusement. If it didn't rain, no one seemed to notice, or at least, no one complained out loud. The calendar, the saints, and the sky were all intertwined in a slow, predictable dance. A gentle reminder that time in the Middle Ages was not a fixed, rational construct, but a softly flowing negotiation between humans, heavens, and clerical scribes. And speaking of clerics, some of the most amusing figures in this sleepy history were those tasked with calculating feast days. They used elaborate tables, marginal notes, and occasionally creative guesswork to determine the date of Easter or other movable feasts. A miscalculation could lead to minor embarrassment, a need for additional prayers, or, in extreme cases, a quiet debate between abbeys over whose lunar calculation was correct. Imagine the sleepy monotony of these clerical disputes, a perfectly gentle drama to describe in slow, calm narration. Monasteries also developed local traditions that added layers of complexity. One abbey might celebrate a saint with an elaborate procession involving banners, music, and bread distribution. A neighboring abbey might mark the same saint with a quiet prayer and a small candlelit meal. Calendars reflected both official ecclesiastical authority and local custom, which sometimes diverged hilariously. A feast could be celebrated differently in every village, adding a subtle patchwork of slow-moving human behavior that historians now look back on with a mixture of admiration and quiet confusion. Even the design of calendars themselves contributed to sleep-inducing fascination. Illuminated manuscripts often contained decorative borders, depictions of seasonal labors, and tiny sketches of animals or people performing mundane tasks. These artistic flourishes reminded readers that even in a highly structured society, human imagination found a way to creep into the margins. Imagine flipping through one slowly, noting the painstaking illustrations, the careful Latin inscriptions, and the tiny sketches of monks sleeping at desks. They all form a gentle, flowing rhythm that is ideal for this kind of narration. Another charmingly tedious aspect of medieval feast days was the constant debate over when exactly a saint should be honored. Local customs frequently clashed with official ecclesiastical rulings. Take, for instance, the Feast of Saint Martin in parts of France. Officially, it was November 11th, but in certain villages, farmers insisted it should coincide with the end of harvest, which varied from year to year depending on rainfall and crop yields. Clerics were often caught in the middle, scribbling careful notes, issuing gentle and quietly sighing at the audacity of peasants who clearly did not understand the sanctity of fixed dates. Monarchs sometimes got involved, mostly for reasons of prestige. A king might insist that a particular saint's day be celebrated with extra pomp, simply because a visiting noble happened to favor that saint, or because the king himself liked to eat goose on that day. Charles IV of France, for example, had a curious habit of combining political expediency with religious observance. If celebrating Saint something or other aligned with granting favors to allies, all the better. Feasts became subtle tools of influence. Villagers complied, clerics recalculated, and the calendar expanded ever so slightly with every new royal whim. And then there were the accidental conflicts, which happened surprisingly often. Imagine a monastery trying to coordinate the feast of Saint Cecilia, while also observing the movable feast of Easter. Sometimes the schedules overlapped inconveniently. Bells rang for one observance, stopped, then rang again for the other. Clerics mumbled prayers in quick succession, and villagers, unsure which feast took priority, might quietly enjoy their bread and ale without any guilt at all. History remembers these as minor confusions, but they were, in their own slow, procedural way, a perfect example of human life intersecting with the calendar. Peasants also had their own interpretations of feast days. Some believed that failing to observe a minor saint's day would result in bad weather, poor crops, or even minor accidents. Others treated it as optional, attending only if convenient. Calendars, in this sense, were both prescriptive and negotiable. Humans interacted with them as best they could, sometimes reverent, sometimes indifferent, often in ways that future historians can only reconstruct slowly and cautiously. Meanwhile, clerics in charge of timekeeping occasionally developed eccentric habits. Some annotated calendars with personal comments. Today I miscounted the moons, but God forgive me, or the baker is late again. Saint Apollonia be praised. Others used illustrations, tiny sketches of monks, animals, or even slightly absurd depictions of saints engaged in mundane tasks. These marginalia remind us that medieval timekeeping was both serious and profoundly human. Clerics were, after all, not machines. They were sleepy, occasionally hungry, often prone to boredom, and sometimes mischievous. Eccentricity was not limited to clerics. Monarchs had their moments as well. Edward III of England, for instance, declared certain feast days with curious justification. Sometimes the reason was political. Other times it was personal preference. One might be forgiven for imagining Edward quietly sipping a cup of wine, deciding that Saint so-and-so deserved recognition because the saint had once been mentioned in an old family chronicle. The result was an ever-expanding calendar, full of minor, slightly redundant observances, slowly drifting across decades. One of the more absurd examples involves overlapping feasts and natural events. Certain saints were commemorated in connection with astronomical phenomena, the rising of a particular star, a solar alignment, or the blooming of a specific flower. Combine that with the movable feasts of Easter and Pentecost, and the calculation became almost absurdly complicated. Clerics spent hours, sometimes days, computing the correct dates. Mistakes were inevitable, and sometimes entire communities ended up celebrating at different times. This minor chaos, though inconvenient, contributed to a quiet rhythm in which human life and cosmic patterns intersected in slow, almost hypnotic ways. Even the most minor saints could cause peculiar disruptions. Saint Apollonia, as I mentioned earlier, required special attention for dental health, a concern most peasants probably ignored, but some monasteries dutifully commemorated. Saint Swithin predicted weather. Saint Lawrence had his roast gridiron. Each of these observances added layers of complexity to an already crowded schedule. Clerics, nobles, and villagers all navigated these layers at their own pace, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in mild conflict. The interaction between calendars and daily labor was subtle but persistent. Bakers, brewers, and butchers adjusted production schedules to align with feast days. Farmers timed planting and harvesting to avoid conflicts with fasts or religious observances. Merchants coordinated markets with local saints' days. Missing a date could result in minor financial inconvenience or gentle social censure. Calendars, in this sense, were not just spiritual guides. They were practical tools embedded in every aspect of medieval life. Monasteries often attempted to standardize these practices, producing illuminated manuscripts with detailed feast day tables. Some included decorative illustrations, peasants sowing fields, monks chanting, kings attending banquets. These illustrations served multiple purposes: teaching, decoration, and a gentle record of human activity, all designed to unfold at a pace slow enough to lull one into contemplation or sleep. Marginal notes occasionally included personal observations, humorous asides, or quietly sarcastic commentary on the inefficiency of the human calendar system. And let's not forget regional rivalries over feast days. One abbey might insist on celebrating a saint on the correct date, while a neighboring monastery observed a local tradition that placed the same feast a week earlier. The result was an informal competition, mostly quiet, with subtle social pressures, gentle reminders, and minor corrections sent between abbeys. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent, just centuries of polite disagreement unfolding in meticulous, sleepy increments. All right, now that we've meandered through clerical miscalculations, eccentric monarchs, and minor feast day conflicts, let's drift gently into the regional peculiarities of medieval calendars. Because, of course, what's a calendar without a bit of local flavor? In France, for instance, the Feast of Saint Martin was observed with great consistency in official records, but local villagers often added their own interpretations. Some communities paired the feast with harvest festivals, turning what was technically a solemn observance into a slow, communal celebration of bread, wine, and, occasionally, an overambitious roast goose. In Burgundy, peasants would march through the fields with small offerings, while nearby towns observed the same saint quietly with a single candle in the church. Calendars were, in effect, living documents, shaped as much by local practice as by papal decree. England had its own charming quirks. Saint Swithin, as we've mentioned, presided over weather predictions. Villagers watched the sky on July 15th, whispering or musing about the next 40 days. Clerics dutifully recorded the outcome, sometimes correcting previous calculations if the sun or rain didn't match expectations. In some cases, these weather-based observances became part of local tradition, subtly influencing planting and harvest schedules. The calendar wasn't just spiritual. It was a slow, living, practical tool. Italy, with its mosaic of city-states, introduced another layer of complexity. Feast days could vary dramatically between regions, often influenced by powerful local families who sought to assert their prestige. A minor saint celebrated in Florence might be ignored in Venice entirely. Couriers and clerics frequently carried updated calendars between cities, carefully annotating local adjustments. Mistakes were minor but persistent, creating a quietly tangled network of dates and observances. Imagine a slow, barely audible chain of messages and marginal notes linking dozens of city-states across decades. The rhythm of human timekeeping is hypnotically complex. Even the Low Countries had subtle variations. In Flanders, certain saints' days coincided with guild activities. Bakers, shoemakers, and weavers would pause work, attend church briefly, and resume at a leisurely pace. Calendars here served dual purposes: religious guidance and practical coordination of labor. Miss a feast, and you might anger a guild leader, or worse, fail to deliver shoes on time. Local adaptations made calendars both functional and occasionally frustrating. And then, of course, there were festivals that almost nobody celebrated correctly. Minor saints, obscure events, or miscalculated feast days often resulted in silent, sleepy disagreement. A monk might record one date, a neighboring abbey another, and villagers would comply with whichever seemed easiest. Sometimes this led to entirely accidental celebrations, like holding a procession during a moonless night or gathering in the church when no one had actually marked the feast officially. Human error gently reshaped the rhythm of time. Monarchs occasionally tried to impose order, often with mild success. Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, for instance, attempted to standardize feast days across his territories. This involved sending detailed instructions to monasteries, bishops, and town councils. Clerics dutifully copied these instructions into manuscripts. Villagers, naturally, interpreted them according to local habit. The calendar became a subtle negotiation between authority, custom, and human laziness. A slowly evolving compromise over decades. Even saints themselves, or rather their stories, contributed to calendar eccentricities. Take Saint Walburga, whose feast day on February 25th coincided with winter hardships in Northern Europe. Villagers incorporated both religious devotion and practical preparations, firewood, food stockpiles, and small offerings to ensure divine favor. Calendars here were both spiritual and utilitarian, a gentle reminder that timekeeping was deeply embedded in survival. Feast days occasionally overlapped with political events, creating minor complications. A coronation, marriage, or treaty might be scheduled near a saint's feast to invoke divine blessing. Conversely, an unexpected feast could disrupt royal plans. Imagine a king preparing for a minor ceremony only to discover that Saint Somebody's Day required additional observances. Clerks would mutter quietly, and courtiers would shuffle papers, all within a rhythm that was slow, meticulous, and profoundly soporific. Illuminated manuscripts from this period beautifully illustrate these complexities. Borders often depict seasonal labors, animals, or humans engaged in everyday tasks. Sometimes there are tiny sketches of local saints performing minor miracles, or monks dozing over their calculations. These manuscripts were both functional and artistic, capturing the gentle, human side of calendars. Reading aloud slowly, imagining each image, provides a kind of rhythmic cadence, perfect for drifting towards sleep, and naturally, some feast days were simply ignored outside of monastic or noble settings. Villagers might skip minor observances entirely, either out of forgetfulness or mild skepticism. Clerics would record the omission, perhaps add a note to correct it the next year, and life would proceed at a slightly slower, slightly disorganized pace. Calendars, after all, are only effective when humans comply, or at least pretend to comply. Regional peculiarities extended even to the calculation of movable feasts. One monastery might use the full lunar cycle, another a simplified approximation. Over decades, this resulted in small discrepancies between neighboring villages. A festival celebrated in one parish might occur several days earlier or later in another. Nobody panicked. Life continued, quietly, predictably, and gently. A testament to the flexible, human-centered rhythm of medieval timekeeping. Finally, consider how calendars interacted with personal devotion. A noble might meticulously follow all feast days, ensuring prayers, fasts, and almsgiving occurred on schedule. A peasant might observe only the largest feasts, doing the minimum required for social propriety. Clerics monitored both, quietly noting compliance, occasionally offering gentle corrections. Time, in this context, was not merely measured, it was negotiated, experienced, and slowly internalized by everyone involved. Secular authorities frequently had opinions about feast days, which they often expressed in ways that added mild chaos to the calendar. Kings, dukes, and local lords sometimes demanded that feasts be moved, combined, or expanded to serve political purposes. For example, a local ruler might insist that a saint's day coincide with a tax collection or a market fair, ostensibly to maximize divine favor, but really to ensure better attendance or higher revenue. Clerics complied, scribes recorded the adjustments, and villagers quietly adapted or ignored instructions entirely, depending on inclination and weather. Charles IV's successors occasionally extended his tendency to adjust calendars. A minor saint's feast could be upgraded to a royal feast with processions, banquets, and fireworks, or whatever approximated a medieval celebration at the time. These modifications didn't disrupt the grand scheme of life entirely, but they added layers of administrative effort for monks, local priests, and anyone keeping household accounts. Imagine a clerk checking a table of saints, sighing and muttering, "And now I must add another procession for the king's whims," before carefully annotating the margin. Sometimes, the interference was almost comically unnecessary. Monarchs might declare a feast for a saint nobody had heard of, simply because a relative had been particularly fond of that saint as a child. This resulted in extra observances, which clerics dutifully calculated, and villagers dutifully ignored, unless the king happened to be visiting. Calendars became negotiation tools between divine, civic, and human interests, constantly adjusted to maintain a delicate balance. Local guilds occasionally contributed their own modifications. Bakers, butchers, and weavers all observed feast days in ways that affected production and commerce. Some guilds mandated additional work on certain saints' days, while others insisted on complete cessation of labor. Clerics and scribes recorded these practices alongside traditional liturgical instructions, producing manuscripts that were part calendar, part local custom guide, part gentle bureaucratic manual. Imagine a monk slowly annotating such a manuscript, quill scratching in the candlelight, with the occasional doodle of a sheep or a baker perfectly suited for slow, contemplative reading. The monarchy itself could be both helpful and inconvenient in equal measure. Kings sometimes used feast days to assert authority, granting or withdrawing privileges, scheduling courts, or issuing edicts. These interventions often required minor adjustments to local calendars. Villagers might comply out of politeness, devotion, or fear. But the practical outcome was that time became slightly elastic, bending to accommodate human authority in subtle ways. This elasticity, when read aloud slowly, forms a hypnotic, almost musical rhythm, perfect for drowsy contemplation. Feast days also shaped social life in quiet but persistent ways. Weddings, baptisms, and funerals were often scheduled to avoid conflicts with major religious observances. Nobles might delay a marriage until after a prominent feast, while peasants timed baptisms to coincide with local saints' days. Clerics recorded these events in parish registers, producing meticulous logs that allowed future generations to trace both spiritual and secular rhythms. This slow interplay between personal lives and the calendar highlights how deeply intertwined medieval timekeeping was with human behavior. Eccentric clerics occasionally took liberties with the calendar. Some annotated marginal notes with personal commentary, I slept through Saint So-and-so's feast. May God forgive me, or the baker again failed to supply bread. Saint Lawrence be praised. Others included doodles of villagers, animals, or saints engaged in mundane, almost absurd tasks. These small human touches remind us that medieval timekeeping was a deeply human activity, not a cold, rigid system. Even the most minor saints sometimes caused unexpected effects. Saint Apollonia, again, was commemorated for dental protection, which occasionally led to humorous or slightly absurd local observances. Villagers might carry small bones, charms, or tokens during her feast, whispering prayers for teeth that were, by modern standards, probably doomed anyway. Clerics recorded these practices carefully, producing manuscripts that combine devotion, superstition, and gentle humor. Exactly the kind of detail that lulls one into a slow, relaxed rhythm. Regional variations persisted too. Italy, with its city-states, produced a patchwork of feast day observances. Florence might celebrate a saint with lavish processions, while Siena treated the same day with quiet reflection. France, England, and the Low Countries had similar disparities. These differences illustrate that calendars were not just spiritual guides. They were living systems shaped by politics, geography, and human preference. The result was a gently tangled web of timekeeping, perfectly suited for calm, sleep-inducing narration. One subtle but interesting aspect involved seasonal labor. Farmers often timed sowing, harvesting, or pruning around feast days. Miss a saint's day, and you might plant too early or harvest too late, with minor but noticeable consequences. Clerics, merchants, and nobles all relied on these rhythms, producing a shared temporal framework that slowly regulated human activity. Calendars thus became a kind of social technology, quietly orchestrating daily life in slow, predictable increments. And let's not overlook the role of illustrations in these manuscripts. Illuminated calendars often depicted seasonal work, saints, animals, and marginal doodles. These images served both as teaching tools and gentle visual rhythms, helping the reader internalize the flow of the year. Imagine slowly describing each illustration: a monk at prayer, a peasant sowing seeds, a saint performing a miracle with mild bemusement. The cadence of the narrative mirrors the careful, repetitive strokes of the scribe, fostering a slow, hypnotic effect. Finally, some feast days became entirely idiosyncratic due to local custom. A village might celebrate a saint based on a minor historical anecdote, a miracle, or even a local legend. These observances were sometimes synchronized with agricultural or commercial events, creating a subtly interwoven pattern of religious, social, and economic life. Clerics recorded these deviations, producing manuscripts that were simultaneously calendars, chronicles, and gentle commentaries on human behavior. Now that we've seen how regional customs and secular authority shaped calendars, let's float gently into the strange, mildly absurd world of feast day disputes and clerical errors. Because nothing lulls the mind into drowsy contemplation, quite like human error stretched over decades. One of the most persistent problems in medieval Europe was miscalculating movable feasts, especially Easter. Monks across different monasteries sometimes arrived at slightly different dates, because calculating lunar cycles was, unsurprisingly, complicated without modern tools. Imagine two abbeys, 10 miles apart, each announcing Easter a week apart. Villagers were left unsure which services to attend, while clerics sent polite letters, gently correcting one another. It was all very orderly, very polite, and very perfect for tonight's relaxed narration. Even fixed feast days could spark minor disputes. Take Saint Medard's Day in France, celebrated on June 8th. Some villagers insisted on celebrating it on June 7th, arguing that the historical record suggested the saint actually passed on that day. Nearby towns disagreed, preferring the officially sanctioned date. Negotiations between clergy were subtle and polite. Marginal notes in manuscripts, careful recalculations, and the occasional slightly sarcastic comment like, "One might assume the saint does not mind." Yet humans continue to quarrel. Clerical errors weren't limited to dates. Occasionally, scribes miscopied manuscripts, creating duplicate feasts or omitting minor saints entirely. This led to small-scale confusion, which future monks and clerics had to unravel. Sometimes a saint was celebrated twice in the same village, once on the proper day and again on the copied error day. Villagers attended both, perhaps silently recognizing the redundancy, perhaps enjoying the extra bread and ale that inevitably accompanied any celebration. The calendar, in other words, became both precise and absurdly elastic, accommodating human imperfection. Moving beyond clerical errors, some disputes involved resources. Feasts often required food, wine, and labor. If two monasteries claimed rights to the same local produce or livestock on overlapping feast days, slow, polite negotiations ensued. Letters exchanged between abbeys detailed who had precedence, which saint was more important, and whether a processional route might be adjusted. Sometimes these disputes lasted years, with marginal notes carefully documenting every small compromise. Imagine reading such correspondence aloud, a perfect rhythm of calm, bureaucratic negotiation. Monarchs naturally sometimes complicated matters further. Edward III, for example, liked to declare extra feasts in honor of obscure saints, often aligning them with personal milestones, minor victories, or even favorite hobbies. Clerics dutifully added these days to the calendar, while villagers complied with varying degrees of enthusiasm. One can almost see a monk sighing, quill in hand, slowly annotating the margins. The king's whim adds another day of bread and ale obligations. God save us. Then there were local eccentricities that gently confound historians. In some villages, a saint's feast was combined with minor astronomical observations, like tracking the moon or noting the appearance of a particular star. Clerics calculated and recalculated, sometimes adjusting the feast to align with lunar events. Villagers, as always, observed these dates with quiet pragmatism. Attend if convenient, ignore if inconvenient, and enjoy the communal meal regardless. Human adaptations slowly modified the calendar. Layer by layer, feasts occasionally intersected with seasonal labor in awkward ways. Farmers planting or harvesting might find themselves caught between fasting requirements and practical necessities. Clerics sometimes issued lenient dispensations, noting that divine understanding extended to practical survival. These marginal notes often included small, almost humorous remarks, like, "If the wheat must be sown, then let it be, for God appreciates a well-fed parish." Such annotations perfectly capture the slow, gentle negotiation between spiritual obligation and earthly necessity. Even saintly legends contributed to minor absurdities. Saint Nicholas, for example, celebrated on December 6th, had local variations of observance. Some villages emphasized gift-giving, others fasting, some merely lit candles and whispered prayers. These differences were meticulously recorded by clerics, creating a network of subtle, overlapping traditions. Imagine reading these accounts aloud, slowly, while picturing slightly different versions of the same saintly observance in neighboring towns. The rhythm itself is hypnotic. Some feasts were inherently quirky. St. Vitus' Day, for instance, was associated with dancing in certain parts of Europe, originally a protective ritual against illness. Clerics sometimes lamented the secular enthusiasm for dancing, but few attempted to stop it. Villagers danced, often awkwardly, with faintly nervous smiles, while the calendar dutifully recorded the saint's day. The combination of solemn ritual and human indulgence adds a gentle, amusing contrast, perfect for relaxed, drowsy narration. Monasteries often tried to enforce standardization, but minor deviations persisted. One abbey might observe Saint Apollonia with an elaborate ritual, while a neighboring monastery performed a simpler ceremony. Letters exchanged between abbeys calmly recorded these differences, occasionally including dryly humorous comments. "We note your observance, though our saint prefers a quieter approach." These polite, slow-moving interactions exemplify the subtle rhythm of medieval timekeeping. Even royal households could contribute unexpected quirks. Queens, princes, and princesses sometimes insisted on observing certain feasts for personal reasons. A princess might favor a saint she was named after, adding additional ceremonies, food, or music. A prince might accidentally miss a line of fast with a minor feast, requiring clerical intervention. These small personal deviations were absorbed into the larger rhythm of calendars, producing layers of subtle, sleepy human complexity. Now that we've wandered through clerical miscalculations and minor disputes, let's float gently into the more idiosyncratic side of medieval feast days. The regions of Europe were full of subtle variations, and human creativity, as always, found a way to leave its mark on the calendar in the Low Countries. For example, certain saints' days were celebrated with tiny, highly localized rituals that appear almost absurd to modern eyes. St. Nicholas' Day might involve carefully placing shoes in windows, but in some towns, children were expected to leave small tokens of gratitude for the saint. Clerics dutifully recorded these practices, producing manuscripts that documented both official liturgy and whimsical local customs. Reading these manuscripts slowly allows one to imagine the calm rhythm of daily life, punctuated by gentle superstition. Northern Italy had its own peculiarities. City-states like Venice, Florence, and Genoa often observed the same feast in subtly different ways, reflecting the whims of local patrons or the influence of guilds. A baker in Florence might prepare a special pastry for a saint's feast, while a shoemaker in Venice might pause work entirely, lighting candles and whispering prayers. Calendars were living documents, absorbing local color and human eccentricity like a slow, gently expanding sponge. Saint Apollonia, again, makes a small appearance here. Known for her association with dental protection, her feast inspired an unusual variety of observances. Some monasteries encouraged parishioners to carry small charms, while others recommended simple prayers before meals. In one particularly sleepy abbey, a monk added a marginal note suggesting that the saint's protection was most effective when combined with a good night's sleep, a comment that seems almost perfectly suited to our current narration. Eccentric saints often overlapped with regional disputes. Saint Medard, as we've discussed, had variable dates across France. Some villages celebrated on the official date, others preferred an adjusted date, reflecting local agricultural cycles. Clerics exchanged gentle letters noting the discrepancies. These minor disagreements rarely escalated, but they created a subtle network of competing observances that quietly shaped village life for decades. Imagine the gentle rhythm of monks copying letters by candlelight, marginal notes added slowly, and villagers attending whichever feast day seemed most convenient. Royal households contributed their own small quirks. Princesses, princes, and minor nobles sometimes insisted on observing particular saints' days for personal reasons. One queen might favor a saint she was named after, producing additional banquets or processions. A prince might mistakenly align his personal fast with a minor feast, requiring clerical adjustments. These tiny personal interventions were absorbed into the broader rhythm of the calendar, demonstrating the subtle interplay between human desire and divine schedule. Some feast days became opportunities for minor civic spectacle. Markets, fairs, and social gatherings were often timed to coincide with saints' days, producing slow-moving communal events. Clerics sometimes recorded these observations with mild commentary, noting how villagers favored bread, ale, or small tokens over solemnity. The calendar thus intertwined with human behavior, structuring both spiritual life and the practical rhythms of everyday activity. The humorous side of clerical life surfaces repeatedly in these records. Monks often included marginalia with playful or slightly sarcastic remarks. Perhaps a note beside the date of St. Lawrence's feast. The baker again forgot the bread. St. Lawrence sighs quietly. Or a sketch of a monk asleep over his calculations, quill in hand, snoring ever so slightly. These touches reveal that even in an era of strict observance, humans approached calendars with gentle humor and sleepy creativity. Regional variation also produced unique rituals. In some Italian villages, St. Lucy's Day involved small, candlelit processions. In parts of Germany, St. Vitus's Day was associated with dancing, intended to ward off illness. Clerics sometimes frowned at excessive enthusiasm but rarely intervened. Villagers, naturally, incorporated their own traditions, producing a patchwork of observances that reflected both devotion and local culture. This slow evolution of custom created a deeply human rhythm, one perfectly suited for calm, slow storytelling. Even the interaction between feast days and lunar cycles added complexity. Movable feasts like Easter required careful calculation, and errors were frequent. Monks sometimes disputed the correct date, leading to minor confusion and polite letters of correction. Villagers attended whichever celebration aligned best with convenience, subtly altering the rhythm of their lives. These small discrepancies, persisting over decades, produced a quietly elastic sense of time, humanized by observation and adaptation. Feasts were also linked to agricultural cycles, subtly shaping labor. Bakers, brewers, and weavers coordinated production with saintly observances. Farmers timed planting and harvesting to avoid conflicts with fasts or major feasts. Clerics issued dispensations when necessary, noting that divine understanding extended to practical necessities. Reading these interactions slowly reveals a rhythm of life at once spiritual, social, and mundane, a slow, hypnotic cadence. And let us not forget the minor saints with truly peculiar reputations. Some were known for protecting animals, others for influencing weather, and a few for more obscure causes like misfortune or sleep. Villagers adapted their daily routines accordingly, observing these days with gentle attention or quiet indifference. Clerics recorded all deviations, producing manuscripts that combined spiritual guidance, practical advice, and occasional dry humor. Finally, regional rivalries occasionally touched on feast day observance. One village might celebrate a saint on an early date, another on the official date, and yet another on a compromise. Clerics exchanged notes politely, often adding marginal commentary that is now slightly humorous. We hope Saint X will forgive these humans their confusion over decades. These negotiations produced a slow, elastic, and very human pattern of celebration, blending obedience, convenience, and whimsy into a gentle social rhythm. Now, let's drift gently across national boundaries and consider the subtle yet persistent disputes between monasteries, abbeys, and clerical authorities in different regions. These disagreements were rarely dramatic in the modern sense, but they unfolded over years, decades, even centuries, producing a slow, hypnotic rhythm of human timekeeping. One of the most fascinating issues involved the calculation of Easter. Monks in England often followed slightly different lunar tables than those on the continent. Letters and treatises were exchanged over decades, politely debating the correct methodology. Sometimes abbeys adjusted their own calendars to align with neighbors. Sometimes they stubbornly stuck to their own systems. Villagers, naturally, followed whichever observance seemed easiest, creating a gently erratic rhythm across regions. Italy, France, and Germany produced similar disputes. Clerics would meticulously copy tables, make marginal notes, and occasionally include dry commentary like, "Perhaps the saint will forgive this disagreement." These exchanges were slow, bureaucratic, and deeply human. There was no urgency, only the quiet insistence that dates mattered, that saints deserved proper observance, and that clerics would continue recording discrepancies for future generations. Secular authorities sometimes intervened in these cross-border issues. Kings and dukes occasionally issued decrees to standardize feast days or correct errors, often in response to complaints from neighboring regions. Clerics dutifully copied these instructions into manuscripts. Villagers adapted at their own pace, sometimes complying fully, sometimes partially, and occasionally ignoring the guidance entirely. The calendar became a negotiation between divine authority, secular power, and human habit, a rhythm perfectly suited for slow, gentle narration. Local customs continued to flourish despite standardization efforts. In Northern Europe, St. Swithin's Day maintained its weather-related lore, while other feasts gained minor agricultural associations. Monks recorded these practices with the same meticulous attention as official liturgical instructions, sometimes adding quietly sarcastic commentary. The villagers continued to consult the weather rather than divine wisdom. The result was a gentle patchwork of spiritual, practical, and human elements layered across time. Minor saints contributed to these eccentricities as well. Saint Apollonia's dental protection, Saint Vita's dancing rituals, or Saint Medard's rain predictions all added small ripples to daily life. Clerics annotated manuscripts with careful instructions, occasionally noting local deviations with dry humor. These small details, read aloud slowly, form a hypnotic rhythm of human interaction with time, faith, and culture. Even royal households played their part. Queens, princes, and minor nobles occasionally adjusted feast days for personal reasons, a birthday, a marriage, or simply preference. Clerics dutifully added these adjustments to local calendars, while villagers complied in varying degrees. One can imagine a monk sighing quietly while annotating a new royal feast. Another day of bread and ale obligations. yet still saintly. Perhaps these small personal interventions became absorbed into the broader pattern of calendar observance over decades. Feast days often coincided with markets and fairs, further intertwining religious and secular life. Villagers planned agricultural work, commercial transactions, and social gatherings around saints' days. Clerics, of course, recorded all deviations, producing manuscripts that combined spiritual guidance, economic coordination, and occasional dry wit. The result was a gently interwoven social rhythm where divine observance, practical necessity, and human whimsy coexisted comfortably. Marginalia in manuscripts reveal glimpses of human personality. Monks occasionally sketch small illustrations, a baker asleep over dough, a villager scratching a head, a saint performing a miracle with slight bemusement. Some notes contain subtle sarcasm. The baker again forgot the bread. St. Lawrence sighs quietly. These glimpses of daily life provide a rhythm that is slow, gentle, and ideal for relaxed hypnotic narration. Regional variation persisted despite attempts at standardization. Venice, Florence, and Genoa observed the same saints' days differently, reflecting local patronage, guild influence, and civic pride. Northern France, England, and the Low Countries experienced similar diversity. Villagers attended whichever observance was convenient, while clerics recorded discrepancies in calm, meticulous detail. Over decades, these variations produced a softly elastic sense of time. Human, adaptable, and slightly whimsical, even minor errors persisted. A miscalculated Easter, a duplicated feast, or a small discrepancy in saintly lore could ripple across villages for decades. Clerics gently corrected these errors in manuscripts, often adding small illustrations or humorous notes to mark the occasion. Villagers, as always, observed what seemed practical, rarely noticing or perhaps caring about the minutiae of clerical debate. The rhythm of life continued, quietly guided by calendars, saints, and human habit. Feast days also subtly influenced domestic life. Families timed weddings, baptisms, and funerals around major religious observances. Nobles sometimes delayed personal ceremonies to avoid conflicts with prominent feasts. Villagers adjusted labor and daily routines accordingly. Clerics issued dispensations when necessary, noting that divine understanding extended to practical necessities. This slow interplay between calendar, devotion, and daily life forms a gentle, hypnotic cadence suitable for long sleep-inducing storytelling. Local festivals maintained their own charm. In some Italian villages, candlelit processions for St. Lucy offered gentle spectacle. In parts of Germany, St. Vitus's Day dancing persisted quietly, often blended with local harvest customs. Clerics sometimes frowned at excessive enthusiasm but rarely intervened. Villagers participated at their own pace, producing a subtle social rhythm layered atop the formal calendar. Having floated across regional disputes and international clerical debates, let's now settle gently into the world of minor saints and the peculiar human behaviors they inspired. These saints, often obscure and idiosyncratic, shaped daily life in ways both practical and absurd, forming a rhythm perfect for relaxed narration. Take, for instance, Saint Apollonia again. While her association with dental protection seems straightforward, local customs added curious layers. In some villages, parishioners would carry small pins or charms during her feast, gently tapping them on teeth to ensure protection. Clerics sometimes recorded these practices with dry commentary. The faithful continue their rituals, despite the saint's obvious preference for quiet devotion. Imagine slowly describing each village's slightly different approach, the monk making notes, a child timidly tapping a molar, a baker quietly observing from the doorway. St. Vita's, as we've mentioned, inspired dancing rituals. In parts of Germany and Bohemia, villagers would perform carefully timed dances on his feast day, intended to ward off minor illnesses. Clerics occasionally frowned upon this excessive enthusiasm, though enforcement was mild. Letters between monasteries record these observations politely, noting variations in choreography and timing. The mental image of slightly awkward villagers dancing dutifully under candlelight or moonlight adds a gentle humor that is perfect for slow, soothing narration. Other minor saints contributed their own eccentricities. Saint Medard, known for weather predictions, inspired elaborate local lore. If it rained on Saint Medard's day, villagers expected 40 more days of rain. If it remained dry, the following weeks would be fair. Clerics annotated calendars carefully, sometimes adding wry marginal notes. The saint remains inscrutable as humans continue to fret. These small, repeated observations created a subtle rhythm, slowly shaping agricultural and social behavior over decades. Quirky clerical anecdotes also appear frequently in manuscripts. Monks sometimes included small sketches of animals, villagers, or saints engaged in mundane tasks. A sheep nibbling a candle, a baker asleep over dough, a saint holding a slightly bemused expression. All these illustrations provide tiny glimpses of human life at a measured pace. Marginal notes often contain dry humor. Brother Thomas miscounted the moons again. The saint looks on with mild disapproval. Reading these aloud slowly creates a hypnotic cadence, perfectly suited for long form, sleepy storytelling. Feast days were rarely experienced in isolation. They intertwined with local labor, markets, and domestic life. Bakers and brewers adjusted production schedules. Farmers timed planting and harvesting, and villagers coordinated weddings, baptisms, and minor ceremonies. Clerics issued dispensations when necessary, noting that divine understanding extended to practical realities. The calendar became a gently living system, structuring both sacred and mundane life in subtle, hypnotic patterns. Even royalty contributed to these minor absurdities. Queens, princesses, and minor nobles occasionally insisted on personal observances. A princess might favor a saint she was named after, producing additional banquets or processions. A prince might mistakenly align personal fasting with a minor feast, requiring clerical intervention. These small personal interventions gradually merged with local customs, producing a layered humanized pattern of observance. Regional variations persisted throughout Europe. In northern France, England, and the Low Countries, neighboring villages might celebrate the same saint on slightly different days or emphasize different rituals. Clerics documented these variations meticulously, often adding playful or slightly sarcastic commentary. The villagers prefer bread and ale to solemnity, yet attend dutifully, one monk might note. Over decades, these small divergences contributed to a subtly elastic, deeply human sense of time. Even minor mistakes were quietly absorbed. Miscalculated feast days, duplicated saints, or conflicting lunar observations were politely corrected in manuscripts. Villagers observed whichever date seemed convenient, often enjoying the extra meal or ale that accompanied the error. The slow, gentle rhythm of human adaptation created a soothing cadence, reinforcing the hypnotic qualities of long-form drowsy narration. Local festivals and markets added another layer of rhythm. Candlelit processions, dancing rituals, and minor fairs synchronized with saintly observances created a gentle temporal structure. Clerics recorded deviations with calm precision, while villagers participated according to custom or convenience. The calendar thus intertwined with social life, producing a slow, layered, and humanized sense of time. Finally, consider the gentle absurdity of overlapping feasts. In some villages, multiple minor saints were celebrated on the same day, producing slightly chaotic but always polite sequences of prayer, food, and ritual. Clerics annotated these overlaps, sometimes with dry humor. The saints tolerate human confusion with quiet patience. Villagers observed the rituals calmly, enjoying the layered ceremonies without urgency or stress. The result is a subtly hypnotic rhythm of life, perfectly suited for slow, sleep-inducing storytelling. Now, let's drift gently into the world of overlapping feasts and the careful, slow, bureaucratic work that went into keeping them organized. In medieval Europe, it was common for multiple saints' days to fall on the same date, producing a quiet, polite tension in calendars that clerics resolved with calm deliberation. In one particularly sleepy abbey in northern France, a marginal note records that Saint Genevieve and Saint Medard both shared a day in June. Clerics debated which observance should take precedence and eventually decided, after polite correspondence spanning several months, that both could be observed sequentially. Villagers attended the rituals at their own pace, enjoying extra bread and ale without urgency. The abbey's manuscripts carefully documented the resolution, including a dry remark. The saints, it seems, are patient with human scheduling. Such overlaps could cascade across regions. Italy, with its city-states, often experienced multiple minor saints' days coinciding with civic festivals. In Florence, Saint Reparata might share a date with a minor local figure, producing an elaborate candlelit procession in the morning and a guild-organized fair in the afternoon. Clerics noted deviations and discrepancies, recording local adaptations and politely correcting errors in subsequent manuscripts. The rhythm was slow, repetitive, and deeply human. A perfect cadence for relaxed, hypnotic reading. Bureaucratic adjustments often involved detailed calculations and careful letter writing. Monks and clerics spent years refining lunar cycles, reconciling local variations, and producing detailed tables for movable feasts. Errors persisted, of course, but clerics approached them patiently. A minor miscalculation in Easter dates might ripple through 3 or 4 neighboring villages before being corrected. With quiet commentary, the saint remains indifferent to human arithmetic. This patience, recorded in painstaking detail, creates a mesmerizingly slow narrative. Even royal households contributed to the overlapping and occasionally absurd nature of feasts. Kings or queens would sometimes schedule personal celebrations near saints' days to invoke divine favor, or simply to enjoy an extra banquet. Courtiers dutifully adjusted schedules, clerics recorded the changes, and villagers accommodated as best they could. One can imagine a monk slowly annotating the margin, another royal whim, yet still saintly and accompanied by extra ale. Local observances added their own quirks. In the Low Countries, villagers celebrated St. Nicholas while also observing minor agricultural saints, blending rituals in ways that clerics patiently documented. Candlelit processions, small dances, and offerings of food produced gentle, repetitive rhythms of devotion, often accompanied by wry, marginal notes. The villagers multitasked their prayers admirably over decades. These practices shaped both the spiritual and social fabric of daily life, producing subtle, hypnotic patterns. Overlap also extended to seasonal labor. Feasts sometimes coincided with planting, harvesting, or winter preparations. Clerics issued dispensations when work conflicted with fasting or ritual obligations. Villagers complied as best they could, sometimes bending rules slightly, sometimes observing rigorously, but always producing a slowly evolving, elastic rhythm of daily life. Marginal annotations often recorded minor deviations with gentle humor. The wheat must be sown. St. Lawrence will forgive this one transgression. Whimsical local traditions further enriched these overlapping observances. In parts of Germany, St. Vitus's Day dancing might intersect with a minor harvest festival, producing hours of measured, slightly awkward communal movement. Clerics documented the timing and sequence carefully, ensuring that liturgical obligations were fulfilled while local customs continued undisturbed. Villagers moved at their own pace, enjoying the rhythm of prayer, work, and play. A hypnotically slow sequence that the modern listener can follow with ease. Even minor saints with obscure purposes added their own peculiarities. Saint Apollonia's dental protection, Saint Medard's rain predictions, or other obscure saints inspired small tokens, charms, or gentle prayers. Clerics recorded these observations with dry commentary, while villagers adapted them to practical concerns. Over time, these minor observances merged with official calendars, producing subtle, multi-layered rhythms of devotion and daily activity. Long-term bureaucratic adjustments ensured that, despite these overlaps and idiosyncrasies, calendars remained functional. Monks compared manuscripts across decades, adjusted lunar calculations, and reconciled regional differences. Letters exchanged between abbeys often included dry, polite commentary. We note your adjustments and will proceed accordingly, trusting the saints to forgive minor human miscalculations. The rhythm of this slow correspondence forms a hypnotic cadence, perfectly suited for extended, drowsy narration. Finally, royal, clerical, and local interactions created an intricate, humanized pattern of timekeeping. Feast days, personal celebrations, labor schedules, and regional quirks blended into a subtle, layered network. Clerics recorded deviations, added wry marginal notes, and preserved the memory of small, slightly absurd human behaviors. Villagers adapted, often improvising, while still maintaining a quiet respect for the overarching rhythm of the year. The result is a gently elastic, deeply human calendar, a slow-moving symphony of devotion, work, and whimsy. Now, let's drift into the final stretch, where minor saints, gentle clerical humor, and slow-moving royal interventions come together to shape the medieval calendar over decades and centuries. As always, we'll keep the pace calm, the tone slightly sarcastic, and the rhythm hypnotically steady. Minor saints provide endless material for sleepy contemplation. Take Saint Drogo, for example, patron of shepherds and coffee enthusiasts, or rather, patrons of oddly specific causes. Villagers carried small charms or whispered prayers for protection over livestock, occasionally adding notes in manuscripts about personal experiences. Clerics often added wry commentary. The sheep remain unbound, yet devotion persists. Imagining these slow, patient rituals, repeated year after year, creates a gentle cadence perfect for reading aloud. Saint Christina of Bolsena inspired subtle but persistent variations. Her feast, associated with minor cures and gentle prayers, were celebrated differently across neighboring villages. Clerics annotated each variation carefully, producing manuscripts filled with polite records of observances. Villagers adapted rituals to local circumstances. A candle here, a minor procession there, perhaps a small offering of bread or wine. Over decades, these tiny adjustments merged into a soft, elastic rhythm of religious and daily life. Royal quirks continued to shape calendars as well. Minor nobles often insisted on observing saints they were named after, or aligning personal milestones with feast days. A queen might schedule a banquet on the feast of a favorite saint, while a prince aligned his personal fasts with another. Clerics dutifully recorded these interventions, sometimes adding gentle humor in the margins. The king desires extra celebration. The saints, as always, tolerate human indulgence. These small human touches subtly modified the calendar's rhythm over decades. Even the smallest clerical errors persisted, creating minor absurdities. Miscalculated feast days, duplicated saints, or tiny discrepancies between manuscripts produced quiet, long-lasting effects. Villagers observed whichever date was convenient, often enjoying the extra bread or ale that coincided with error. Clerics later corrected mistakes, adding marginal notes with dry humor, like, "Brother Thomas miscounted the moons again. The saints forgive him quietly." These small human touches blend perfectly with the hypnotic cadence of medieval timekeeping. Local festivals continued to add subtle layers of whimsy. Candlelit processions, dances, minor fairs, and guild activities often coincided with feast days. Clerics carefully recorded deviations, while villagers participated at their own pace. Even when multiple feasts overlapped, communities adapted with calm pragmatism. One procession might follow another, or a single ceremony could honor several saints simultaneously. The rhythm of life continued gently, quietly, and predictably, ideal for slow, sleep-inducing narration. The long-term evolution of calendar traditions was gradual, subtle, and deeply human. Clerics copied manuscripts across generations, compared regional variations, and corrected discrepancies with patience. Royal interventions added small adjustments, while local customs introduced whimsy and charm. Minor saints' legends inspired peculiar rituals, and agricultural cycles intertwined with spiritual observances. All these elements combined into a layered, elastic system of timekeeping, slow-moving, deeply human, and gently hypnotic. Even the most absurd local practices were absorbed over time. Dancing for Saint Vitus, charms for Saint Apollonia, or weather-based prayers for Saint Medard became part of a softly interwoven temporal fabric. Villagers and clerics adapted, recorded, and observed, producing subtle variations across decades and centuries. Reading these patterns aloud slowly reveals a rhythm of human life that is calm, repetitive, and perfectly suited to relaxation in monasteries. Marginal notes reveal small, personal anecdotes that are charmingly human. A monk falling asleep over calculations, a baker misplacing bread, a child nervously carrying a charm, all recorded politely, sometimes with wry commentary. These anecdotes illustrate the daily interaction between humans, saints, and the calendar. They remind us that timekeeping in the medieval period was not rigid, but gently flexible, infused with human error, humor, and adaptation. Finally, the interplay between secular authority, clerical precision, and human habit produced the medieval calendar as we now understand it. A slowly evolving, deeply layered system of feasts, fasts, and minor saints' days. Regional differences persisted, minor errors persisted, whimsical local customs persisted, and yet the calendar remained functional. Kings, queens, monks, villagers, and guilds all contributed to this delicate balance, creating a quietly hypnotic rhythm that guided daily life for centuries. As we close this gentle exploration, we see that medieval timekeeping was not just a system of dates. It was a tapestry of human behavior, devotion, whimsy, and error. The saints observed quietly, the clerics annotated meticulously, the villagers adapted gently, and the royals added just enough personal flair to keep things interesting. Over decades and centuries, these small interactions produced a rhythm that was simultaneously practical, whimsical, and soothing, perfect for a long, calm night of reflection and sleep. So, as we settle down, perhaps dim the lights and let your mind drift over these centuries of slowly unfolding feasts, minor saints, and human habits. Consider the gentle absurdities, the patient clerics, the slightly demanding royals, and the quiet villagers attending to their daily lives. Time itself, measured and recorded, yet flexible and deeply human, carries us softly into a peaceful, drowsy rhythm, one that can last a long, long while. And with that, we conclude our slow, gentle journey through the evolution of the medieval calendar and feast days. Good night, and may your sleep be as calm and measured as the centuries of human effort that brought these traditions to life.